The wedding was the scandal of the century. On one side, Lina, a 70-year-old blind billionaire whose fortune could buy the entire city. On the other, Thomas's, a 24-year-old street cleaner who spent his days picking up trash for a few pennies. The city's elite whispered in the back of the church. They called him a gold digger. They called her a lonely, senile woman. Lina's own family stood there with lawyers ready, waiting for the moment they could prove Thomas's was a fraud. But as Thomas's took Lina's hand and whispered the vows into her ear, he wasn't looking at her bank account. He was looking at a secret he had carried for 15 years. You see, everyone thinks Thomas is married for the money. They think he hit the jackpot. But the truth is much more shocking. Thomas's didn't choose Lina because she was rich. He chose her because of a dark night, a rainy street, and a hit-and-run accident that Lina thought she had hidden forever. The wedding wasn't the end of a fairy tale. It was the beginning of a cold, calculated plan. Stay with me, because what this street cleaner does, the moment they return from the altar, will leave you speechless. She swept the gutters before sunrise, the broom's worn straw whispering over cobblestones while the city still dreamed. And by dusk, she was the woman everyone pointed at over champagne and chandeliers. The poor street cleaner who married a 70-year-old blind billionaire. Nobody guessed the secret he had tucked away in a heavy envelope, the kind of thing that does not belong to gossip pages, but to vaults and quiet lawyers' desks. Nobody saw what patience and a single, careful hand could do. Her name was Lina Ortega. She learned the city's map through its refuse, where the bakery left stale croissants for hungry pigeons, which stoop hid a pair of gloves during winter, which stoop belonged to a widow who always left a bowl of soup on the doorstep for the men who worked nights. Lina's hours were the kind other people forgot, the hours when buses exhaled steam and neon signs lost their arrogance. She loved small things, a child's forgotten scarf reunited with relieved fingers, the way sunlight at 5 in the morning turned a puddle into a mirror. Lina was not ostentatious. She kept her pennies in a soda can nailed beneath her sink, and her best coat had a patched sleeve. Her laugh was short, but honest, and she had a habit, born of a life that asked favors of her, of bending down when people dropped their dignity and picking it up for them. That habit mattered more than anyone guessed. Across town, in an apartment that rose like a polished tooth above a line of cafes, lived Thomas Hargrove, 70 years, voice like a low brass instrument, eyes that had not looked at light for 20 years. He moved through rooms guided by memory and touch, with a cane of dark wood whose top was worn by the palms of hands that had built empires. He carried his blindness with discretion. It was never an apology. It was a fact kept even. He read books in Braille, tasted meals with the curiosity of a man who had worked too hard to take anything on trust, and he spoke with the kind of careful generosity that made strangers feel less like interruptions and more like possibilities. How two lives met is a small miracle of human randomness. For Lina, it was the day she stopped to sweep the marble entryway of a hospital because an old neighbor had been admitted and nobody had that hour. Thomas was there, visiting a friend. His chauffeur had underestimated a bout of rain and left the umbrella behind. Lina offered her umbrella. They spoke for 20 minutes under a stubborn drizzle. She talked about the city as if each alley were an old acquaintance. He listened as if he had all the time in the world. A week later, a letter arrived. Would she come to tea? The tea turned into dinners. The dinners turned into long conversations that were not about who had money or who did not, but about habit and regret, memory and small mercies. It was the sort of match that social calendars ate for breakfast. The tabloids prepared metaphors. The neighbors tutted. Friends called with the affection of people pointing out the obvious. He's a gentleman, people said. She's a sweet soul. Which, beneath polite veneers, often read like a verdict. A woman in the wrong suit for a man who wore bespoke time. They announced it quietly. No spectacle. Thomas had once been married. He knew the theatre of a wedding could drown the point of partnership. They wed in a small registry office with a handful of witnesses and a single photograph of his late sister pinned to a wall. For Lina, there was no glittering dress, just a coat that buttoned up to her chin and hands that smelled of street soap. They left the registry holding hands like two people who had decided the world could be trusted for at least one afternoon. The city did not forgive its pleasures easily. Where there is a surprise, rumor tails it like bad breath. High society, which lives by definition on stories, supplied its own commentary. At parties where patrons spoke in annual gifts and committee seats, a question would float like dust. What did she see in a man who could not see? The answer they guessed had 3 syllables: gold, air, scandal. Lina felt those whispers the way the river feels a skiff's shadow. Present, almost invisible, but altering the current beneath. Thomas did not try to convince them. He had money to spend and discretion to spend it with. He did things in small, stubborn chests, donations to a clinic without fanfare, scholarships named for dead towns, a letter sent anonymously once a year to a woman who lived across the country and did not know why someone wrote. Lina watched him sign paperwork with the focus of someone who saw consequences as people tend to see weather, inevitable and manageable. She learned that there are men who are generous because they like to be, who measure kindness by its reach, not by the applause it gathers. The marriage caused interest. It caused discomfort. It caused scorn that took vivid forms. The person who led many of those forms was not always the same. It might be a cousin who had expected a different kind of inclusion in estate conversations, a social climber who had imagined matrimonial advantage as a ladder, or the woman who had long believed the household's baskets would someday be hers. In Lina's world, people warned her gently, and sometimes not so gently. In their world, they told stories that were kinder to their own assumptions. They managed a life on different floors of the same city. Lina kept her routine of mornings. She cleaned and sang quietly under her breath, pocketing coins and secrets the way other women pocketed handkerchiefs. In the evenings, she would go to Thomas's apartment. They would eat the same soup at the same time and talk about nothing and everything. Sometimes, when the world roared outside with headlines and the slant of late-night talk shows, Thomas would reach out and steady her hand. There was a sense, in those still moments, of trust that did not require sight. Then came the funeral. It was the sort of event that gathers a crowd of 2 kinds, those who grieve and those who make performances of grief because the room happens to be convenient. Thomas's friend, an old partner in ventures, and a man who had been a nationalist of deals, died suddenly in the spring. The funeral took place in a chapel, whose stained glass remembered churches that forgot the names of those who paid for its windows. Lina thought she would be another mourner, a small presence among many. She did not expect the choreography that would be unleashed. Funerals make people unscrupulous because grief bends the rules, and grief can be performed like a script. The Hargrove family, tightly knit and used to owning impressions, had planned. They had invited the press under the quietest pretense. They had set seats like the pieces of a board game, positions that implied propriety, not invitation. Lina arrived early, her coat buttoned, her hair pulled from her face. She had baked a small loaf of bread for the chapel's volunteer staff, an act she had learned from childhood and kept because it made things human. Inside, the air held the smell of lilies and old paper. The pews absorbed coughs. When it came time for a eulogy, a cousin rose with the exact cadence of someone rehearsed to hurt without seeming to do so. He spoke of devotion, of loyalty, of a long life. He spoke of business, of prudence, of a household preserved. Then, in a sweep that was practiced and cruel, he spoke of appearances. He implied that those who showed up newly attached to and newly married to the deceased should prove their motives. The room performed its gasp on cue. Someone, Lina later learned it was a woman named Veronica, whose social ladder had depended on proximity to the Hargrove name, clutched at a purse and looked toward Lina as if she were an ornament she might remove. It is difficult to articulate the unique tenderness of humiliation at a funeral. Not only the sting at being accused of falseness, but the sense that the very grief one has come to share can be weaponized against you. Lina felt the weight of eyes like coins dropped on a table. Someone near the front whispered that there were recordings, texts on her phone, a timeline that tells a different story. A journalist at the back scribbled as if the syllables were gospel. When the service ended, the crowd did not dissolve into private sorrow. They formed into a ring of curious and cruel spectators. A woman who had chosen her place among the Hargroves as if choosing a good handbag approached Lina with a smile that had never seen a hand scrub a stoop. "Forgive me," she said, warm and slow, the kind of politeness that is its own blade. "We were just wondering, how much does a wife like you know? How much is arranged?" Arranged. The word was familiar. Lina had arranged brooms on a cart all her life. Arrangements had been the thing she trusted. Neat ties, compost separated from recyclables, the system that made her corner of the city work. This arrangement was different. It smelled of accusation. They took photographs. They threaded the story into conversations at club lunches and charity dinners. The tabloids printed a picture of Lina's patched coat beside a studio portrait of Thomas, chosen because it suggested a contrast the readers loved: poverty next to privilege. The photographs travelled faster than explanations. Worst of all, the Hargrove trustees made their move. In a room slick with mahogany and motive, Thomas's adult nephew, Julian Hargrove, delivered a statement to the press that had been whispered into comfortable ears for months. He claimed, with the smug tone of someone who reads press releases for sport, that the Widows' Council, if there were any, should be careful. "We will ensure the estate is protected from opportunists," he said. The phrase hung between cameras and lilies. Opportunity was a word that, in their mouths, suggested moral vacancy. The cameras sampled it, chewed it, spat it into microphones. Everyone presumed something then, that Lina would be pushed aside, that the legal engine would churn in favor of relatives who wore tailored sorrow. The rumor that had been seeded, whispered that Lina had married for money, assumed the weight of evidence simply by the public's appetite for stories that read like fables. She went home to a small apartment where the kettle took minutes to boil, and the sheet music of her life was a grocery list. Friends called with two kinds of sympathy. Some had the raw edge of people who had known when someone would be used. Others sounded like the save-face callers who offer advice and then vanish. Lina sat on her narrow bed and listened to the city breathing at night. A siren, the distant laugh of a bar, the thunk of someone's door. She felt strangely hollow, like a pocket turned inside out. 3 days later, at her apartment door, she found an envelope taped to the frame. It was simple: brown paper, the edges softened by rain, a silver key threaded through the string. There was no note, no explanation. The key was small and cold, unexpected as a coin in a shoe. It fit easily into the hollow of her palm. It had a single engraving on the side: H. A letter that could have meant anything. She nearly threw it away. Then she thought of Thomas's thumbprint on a soup spoon, the way he had once hummed a lullaby that he said came from the sea, a song he had taught the child he had known when he had run his hand over a chest of old photographs. The memory made the key heavier in her hand, as if weight can be made by thought. Lina carried the key to Thomas's apartment because of habit, because the world's neatness had taught her that tools belong where the hands that might use them are. When she reached his threshold, the doorman raised an eyebrow at the sight of her coat, the smallness of the key. She signed in. world, even the ostentatious world, has formal ways of admitting surprises. Inside, the apartment smelled of cedar and lemon oil. Thomas's son, a man named Marcus, who had never liked Lina the way one dislikes a documented fact, spoke with the economy of those who have practiced disdain. He said, "You shouldn't be here," like a sentence someone saves for a courtroom. Lina said nothing. Silence is a tool, if you know how to use it. The safe deposit box was in a numbered room of a bank that smelled like cotton and promises. The box bore a metal tag with a number and a tiny scrawl of the same H that had been on the key. Lina had never opened a bank box. She had put money under a tin, yes, but never in a vault that required official attendance. The woman at the counter looked at her hands and then at the key and did precisely what protocol required. She verified identity, she called an assigned number, she asked if anyone accompanied, she requested a signature. Lina did what the world asked of her. She signed beneath her name. Inside the box was a single folder. The folder contained a letter on heavy paper, a photograph of Thomas and Lina together, one she had not seen, and a set of documents that looked, at first glance, like complicated machinery not meant for her hands. There was also a small leather-bound book with the word "Instructions" stamped inside in neat, old-fashioned type. She read the letter with fingers that trembled in ways that had nothing to do with cold. The handwriting was Thomas's, steady, with little flourishes on the tails of his letters. He had written as if he were sitting across from her, as if she were reaching for his hand. "My dear Lina," he wrote, "if you are reading this, I am gone, and the world is already trying to make you small. You are not small. Do not let them make you into that story. I have prepared these things for you because I know what people will try. I do not trust certain bloodlines with truth. I trust you." The documents were careful and deliberate. They described an irrevocable trust, funded years ago, a separate charitable vehicle he had seeded, an executor, a lawyer named Samuel Archer, who had been a friend for 3 decades, and conditional releases that would trigger upon certain events. The language was dense but legible: discretionary trust, beneficiary nominee, foundation charter, instructions for public disclosure. There were timestamps of wire transfers tied to foundations, letters from accountants verifying contributions, and notarized statements that had the thick patience of someone who had learned to prepare for human treachery. One page made her eyes stop. A paragraph titled, "For the Protection of Lina Ortega." It read not like a boast, but like armor. Thomas had left her legal authority to certain funds through the trust, a provision for a caretaker allowance for the child, and, more surprising, a clause that entrusted the executor with the task of revealing evidence of any collusion intended to defame her in the hours after his death. He had foreseen the exact arc of embarrassment, and had given the executor permission to act not quickly, but legally, to gather and present what was necessary to protect her reputation, to secure funds for the child, and to launch a charitable arm that would bear his and her names. There were explicit instructions about timing and dignity. No public mindless shaming, but a carefully staged presentation of documents that would make the truth visible and irrefutable. There was also, at the bottom of the stack, a simple line in Thomas's handwriting: "Patience, my daughter." Lina folded the letter slowly. The word "daughter" surprised her, an intimacy that bypassed blood ties. It tightened something in her chest like a belt. The legal scaffolding made sense in a way grief often does not. There were trusts in existence that shielded beneficiaries from sudden legal skirmishes. There were charitable vehicles that could be activated to provide both protection and public purpose. Thomas had used the tools of the very class that now mocked her to secure something she had never expected, a means of dignity. She could have left then. She could have taken the funds and retreated into the small, quiet life she had always known, buying a modest house with a garden and keeping her hands in dirt that would not be photographed. Instead, when Samuel Archer arrived, grey at his temples and slow with the sort of authority a man acquires when courts have listened to him, he explained what Thomas had prepared in the terms of his profession and without sentiment. "There are 3 things to understand," Samuel said, laying a folder on the table, as if setting a clock that had to be wound. 1. These documents are valid and enforceable. 2. The executor will act where the law permits and will not act where it does not. 3. The public revelation required, if you choose to make it, can be crafted to protect you legally and morally. He placed a set of printed screens before her, photographs of messages, emails with timestamps, a short clip of a voice message marked with a time and a sender. Each had a provenance attached, dates, the server through which it had moved, a notarized chain of custody. Evidence, Samuel called it, the way surgeons call instruments. He did not promise a theatrical revenge. He did not promise that the Hargrove family would be stripped of everything in a weekend. He promised the machinery of law and the slow, devastating precision of truth. The documents authorized Samuel to present compiled evidence in a public forum if and when Lina wished, and to open the trust's protective funds for the child and for a charitable foundation that Thomas had asked to be named after his late sister. There was a plan, and in it, a map. Thomas had not been naive. He had anticipated someone claiming Lina as opportunistic. He had anticipated slander. He had anticipated what grief would make people do. He had placed his trust in the one person he believed would take his assets and do something that would not simply enrich, but enact a small justice. Lina listened. She felt the city she loved outside the window, its life rising again with the day. She understood, in a new way, that power sometimes lives in patience, not in spectacle. Thomas's letter had said as much. In the days that followed, the immediate storm settled into a different sort of pressure. Julian Hargrove continued to make statements about protecting the family legacy. Veronica spoke at luncheons in a way that suggested she had always been the wounded party. The press, greedy for angle and deadline, dangled both sympathy and suspicion like insects around a light. People asked Lina questions she could not answer without the legal seal. Friends offered blankets. Strangers offered plates of food. The city watched, half pitying, half waiting for the next detail to drop. Lina met Samuel a second time in a modest office that smelled of books and tea. He opened a folder and slid a timeline across the table. Months marked for action, for learning, for appearances. "This isn't instantaneous," he said. "This is months of building narrative, of assembling allies, of creating an architecture that cannot be toppled by gossip alone." The timeline read like the plans of someone who believed in architecture over fireworks. There would be quiet philanthropy, small grants to the clinic that had once treated a child Lina had bandaged as a teenager, scholarships in the names of working women, discreet public appearances where Lina would be seen doing the things she had always done without the camera's glare. The idea was to build credibility, not with headlines, but with repeated acts. He spoke of message control, of careful release of evidence, not as a lob of accusation, but as a demonstration. "What if they try to contest the trust?" Lina asked, wanting to know what would happen if the Hargrove engine went full tilt. Samuel's face did not change. "Family disputes happen," he said, "but the documents are airtight in the ways that matter." He prepared witness statements, notarized transfers, and an irrevocable trust that limits the grounds for contestation. People can waste money suing. They cannot create facts where none exist. Lina felt relief and the strange prick of vindication that is less personal and more principled. Someone had prepared in their own private way to defend her integrity. The key in her pocket felt heavier. It was no longer merely a metal object. It was a promise that the world could be engaged on terms other than gossip. And yet there was a moral question that sat like a small stone under Lina's tongue. Now that she had the means to humiliate back, would she? Thomas had been specific. He had wanted dignity preserved. The executor had promised discretion. But the human thirst for retribution is the most democratic of impulses. It belongs equally to slanderer and slandered. Lina felt the tide of bitterness rise and then recede because she would not let it drown her. She decided to do nothing spectacular. She would take time. That was the first act of strategy. Invisibility made visible. She would not tweet accusations nor storm into luncheons. She would learn the terms of trusts, read the dry language of foundations, practice the calm that Thomas had shown when he spoke of the sea. She would use the funds not to amplify her hurt, but to create something that could help others who had been small and then humiliated. Before she left Samuel's office, he handed her a list of tasks that read, less like orders and more like a manual for living large without losing one's smallness. Find allies, people who had reputations of integrity. Reconnect with her community, the people whose names belonged to the charities she would one day support. Learn to speak in rooms where people valued degrees and pedigrees. Keep a journal of evidence. Do not engage in social media wars. He emphasized balance. The law would protect her. The public would be persuaded by the repeated cadence of good works. Outside the office, the city smoked in the noon heat. Lina stood at the curb and looked at the crowd of people who passed in a stream of different lives. A child ran by with a paper boat. An old man dozed on a bench with his hat over his face. Lina folded the list into her palm like a map and began walking. She did not yet know how to move among chandeliers without feeling like a stranger. She did not know the names of journalists who mattered. She had never given a speech and had not needed to. But she understood the moral architecture Thomas had built. Truth measured by documents, faith measured by slow acts, justice measured by evidence and law. It was not flashy. It was not fast. It was precise. That night, she sat by her window and rewrote a lullaby Thomas had once hummed. The melody was plain. She added a verse that spoke of the city's mourning, of brooms and bread, of lights, and the people who love little things. She folded the paper and tucked it into the small leather book Thomas had left in the box. The book's pages would be a quiet ledger of what she intended to do. Small donations, visits to the clinic, meetings with community leaders. Each entry would be a stone placed in a path she would not allow others to rewrite. In the days that followed, she began to appear. First at the clinic, where a nurse with a steady smile recognized her and embraced her without questions. Then at a community shelter where she offered to help clean and talk, and quietly to donate funds from a trust that had a line item earmarked for community resiliency. She did not announce the donations. She let them bloom into gossip that worked for her instead of against her. People began to talk about the woman who had been kind enough to make anonymous gifts to places that needed them. The whisper of rumor slowly nudged in a different direction. Sympathy curdled into curiosity and finally into respect. But not everyone was satisfied by slow work and quiet generosity. In the background, Julian and Veronica, those whose positions had been threatened by the marriage, began to gather their own artillery. They were social strategists rather than thugs. Their weapons were schedules and invitations, insinuations and carefully edited photographs. They began to place people at events where Lina might be photographed. They fed stories to columnists who liked their gossip with a hint of malice. A particular woman, a rival named Elisa, who had once been a friend of Veronica's and who had her own stake in the story, began to plant suggestive posts suggesting Lina's motives were not pure. If Lina felt rage, she folded it away like a rag to be used later. She kept a list. She kept the ledger in the book Thomas had given her. She gave money to the clinic and to the school where the boy with the paper boat would one day study. She met with a PR consultant, one who had worked for non-profits, and for people who needed a public face that told a true story. The consultant advised caution. "Let the evidence speak," she said. "We will not use spectacle. We will use a steady drumbeat of action." Months moved like a river that does not hurry, but erodes bank by bank. Lina learned the language of trustees and charitable commitments. She visited the bank and learned how to sign documents with the authority granted to her, how to approve a grant, how to meet with auditors who would ask hard questions and then nod when answers were honest. She learned to compose a brief remark for a luncheon where she would talk about work, not wealth. Each practice was a stone on which she could step. And all the while, the city watched. Those who had once sneered began to have new words. Where there had been suggestion of opportunism, there was now a pattern of help. The press, which is always hungry for contradictions, found new contradictions to chew on. "From street cleaner to philanthropist?" one column asked. The question did not mock in the way the earlier pieces had. It invited curiosity, yet even as she built legitimacy, the shadows of the funeral remained. Whispers turned toward tactics. Veronica and her allies began to move toward a greater humiliation, a public accusation designed to look like proof, an allegation of a pregnancy, a claim that Lina had fabricated a family tie to win sympathy. It was not a subtle pivot. It was a low, cruel instrument, and it aimed not only at Lina, but at the child Thomas had mentioned in his letter, the small symbol of continuity that his enemies thought they could suffocate with rumor. On a grey Tuesday, while Lina was at the clinic handing a small check across the counter to pay for a child's medicine, her phone lit up with a series of messages from unknown numbers. Screenshots circulated like contagion, an image of a sonogram, a line of text alleging paternity, a claim that Lina would be barred from the estate if she could not prove the child's lineage. The images were formatted professionally, with a watermark that suggested they had been prepared by someone who knew how to make things look official. It hurt, yes. It was sharp, like a cold coin pressed against skin. But it also told Lina something useful. Her opponents were not content to wait for the slow work of law and reputation. They wanted to force her hand early. They wanted to call the question before the foundation could gather its board, before her allies could be listed, before the charity could be properly launched. She did not respond to the messages. Instead, she called Samuel. He listened, and then, in his quiet lawyer voice, said, "We anticipated attempts at character assassination. We have recorded those attempts as they appear. Keep everything. Do not delete. Forward the messages to me. We will document the provenance. We will not be baited." Lina forwarded the messages. She kept the screenshots in a folder labeled evidence, the sort of domestic bureaucracy that felt both tiny and enormous. Samuel initiated a preservation order, an instruction to the platforms and to the servers where the images had been hosted, to preserve metadata. The law is a slow animal, but it is precise. It does not cure damage, but it lays the pathway for remedy. It was then that Lina made a choice that would be visible. She would not shrink. She would not allow the rumor to define the child's life or the meaning of her marriage. Thomas had left a structure not for vengeance, but for protection. She would use it that way, and when the time came, the evidence would not be a theatrical ambush, but a carefully held set of facts. Messages with timestamps, financial transfers with names, emails with metadata that could not lie. The strategy was patient and surgical. It required time, allies, and the kind of public ritual that does not humiliate but clarifies. On a wet evening, as thunder arranged itself over the city like a drumroll, Lina sat on her stoop and opened the leather book. She turned to a clean page and wrote, "Do this with truth. Do no harm that is not necessary. Build for the child." She folded the page and slid the silver key into the book's spine, as if pressing the promise into a place where it could be found when necessary. The legal machinery hummed like a distant engine. The Hargrove family circled like a pride, uncertain which member would break the surface first. Lina felt the city shift beneath her feet, not in the dramatic, sudden way tabloids promise, but in the slow rearrangement that comes when people rewrite how they will see one another. Her transformation had begun, but she had not yet stepped onto the stage Thomas had prepared for her. She balanced the ledger of small deeds against the ledger of legal proof. She practiced speeches in empty rooms. She met with community leaders and made lists. She allowed herself a private, modest ritual. Every night, she would hum the lullaby and add a line about the people who clean and cook and hold the city together. The lullaby became a map and a memory, and quietly, a strategy. The next event would be a small fundraiser, a low-key gathering the clinic organized to celebrate a new wing. It was an opportunity to show the public the work, to introduce those who would one day be her board members, to make visible the investments she was already directing into community programs. It was not a battlefield. It was, if anything, a rehearsal. What she did not know yet was how far the Hargroves would go, nor did she know the exact names that would be dragged into public light when Samuel opened his files. But the silver key had already turned the lock on a world she had never thought possible. And once a door is opened, even the smallest of people must decide whether to walk through with a broom in hand or with a posture that says, "I belong." She rose from the stoop and walked toward the clinic, the leather book under her arm, and the rain beginning to spit in the streetlights. The city carried on, unaware that some of its stories were about to be rewritten, not with shouts, but with patience, evidence, and the care that comes from someone who knows how to wait. The first months of planning lay ahead, and the small acts would accumulate into a shape that would not be easy to shake. A silver key, a sealed trust, a lawyer who kept his word, a grieving city ready to judge. Lina folded her coat tighter against the drizzle and thought of Thomas's handwriting. "Patience, my daughter," and understood at last that power could live in the quiet places between decisions. She would not rush. She would not be baited. She would let the truth, measured and precise, do what gossip never could. It would free her and protect what mattered most. The clinic's fluorescent light hummed like a small choir when Lina crossed its threshold. The nurse who hugged her that morning did not ask for a story. She only accepted the loaf Lina pressed into her hands and nodded as if the two of them shared a language older than gossip. Lina moved through the room as she had learned to move through the city, with purpose and low friction. She handed over the check Samuel had authorized for medicine, signed a receipt, and left without comment. Outside, rain smeared the world into watercolor. The leather book rested heavy against her ribs, the silver key taped beneath a page where she had written the day's tasks. Samuel's timeline unfurled in real life. Week by week, Lina learned the terms she once thought belonged to other people. Fiduciary duty, board minutes, conflict of interest policies. She sat through meetings that smelled of coffee and opinion and took notes as if she were practicing a new language. At first, she stumbled over jargon. She mispronounced endowment and felt the flush of embarrassment. Then she wrote the terms in her own ledger, defined them with the blunt poetry she had always used to name things on the street. An endowment is seeds. A trustee is a gardener. Those metaphors steadied her. She chose allies with care. There was Rosa, the nurse who had taught Lina how to dress a wound and who accepted an invitation to sit on the clinic's advisory committee. There was Ahmed, a math teacher who ran an after-school program where Lina once returned a lost lunchbox and had been thanked with a shy smile. Samuel introduced 2 men and a woman who would become the charter board of the foundation. An accountant whose grey eyes missed nothing, a social worker who had once saved a child from slipping into foster paperwork, and a retired judge who had volunteered in legal clinics for decades. These were people whose reputations showed up in small ways, who kept receipts and answered calls they did not owe. They became the scaffolding she would lean on. She learned the quiet art of appearances, Samuel coached her on statements that refused to be bait, short declaratives about mission and fact, not about feelings. A PR consultant taught her how to keep the gaze steady when lights flashed. People remember confidence when it is not arrogant, the consultant said, tapping a page of notes. They also remember contradictions. If you act with purpose, rumors lose their hunger. Lina practiced standing under bright lights and speaking plainly about a grant to buy new refrigeration at the clinic. She said what needed saying and nothing more. Months moved on that slow hinge that grinds down obstacles. Lina signed forms. The accountant approved wire transfers. Board members met. She visited schools to ask how the scholarships could be structured. She met mothers in dim community rooms and listened. Each visit became a small deposit in a bank of credibility. A photograph of Lina handing a check to a school librarian was captioned in the local paper. "One of us helps us." The piece did not sneer. Julian and Veronica did not relent. They calculated and pushed, like people who practice strategy the way others practice tennis. They planted a columnist in a weekend magazine who wrote about social boundaries and the dangers of charitable theatre. They floated a rumor that Lina had disappeared with gifts meant for the clinic. They tried to place a private investigator near the clinic to photograph scheduled meetings, an attempt to produce images they could edit to look sinister. Their most dangerous move, however, was the fabrication of evidence. An ultrasound image, doctored medical forms, a set of emails created to suggest complicity, and a narrative that Lina had manufactured a child for sympathy and access. The image landed in an inbox of an eager reporter with a note that smelled of authority. A blog that trafficked in scandal published a thin piece, its incredulity thinly veiled as concern. Comments proliferated. Someone on the internet suggested that the foundation was a front. The city's old hunger for spectacle quickened. Lina felt each jab, but she did not answer in kind. Samuel did. He set the preservation orders. He retained digital forensic experts who could trace origins and logins and metadata the way a cartographer traces a coastline. They pulled server logs, subpoenaed timestamps, and extracted IP addresses tied to a small PR firm that did more reputation management than truth verification. The firm, when confronted, rattled against its own contracts and then squeaked out a confession that a junior employee had been paid to manufacture context. The confession was a legal document, not a shout on a screen. It was the kind of thing that, once on paper, was heavy. There were other small victories. The Hargrove trustees argued to limit the foundation's voice, clauses in old agreements designed to keep control of public relations. Samuel countered with gatekeeping mechanisms Thomas had left in place, the irrevocable trust's conditions that named the foundation's purpose and required transparency in governance. The trustees could litigate. They could not unmake the paperwork that Thomas had, with a man's patience, drafted and notarized years earlier. When Lina found herself tempted by private fantasies of public humiliation, images she did not allow to be drawn in the book, she went instead to the places that stitched the city together. She scrubbed a shelter's kitchen one afternoon, simply to feel the feel of a scouring brush and the satisfaction of clean counters. A volunteer who had watched the tabloids greet the marriage put his hand on her shoulder and said, "You're doing what you said you would." That so small a phrase steadied her more than any headline. The weeks bent toward a single public moment the board had been planning for months. The launch of the foundation's first major initiative, a legal aid fund to protect people preyed upon by manipulation and false claims. It would be held in a converted ballroom on the river, marble floors, chandeliers, and windows that opened onto the same skyline Lina had swept at dawn. Invitations went to donors, community leaders, journalists, and, inevitably, to the Hargrove family. Samuel and Lina decided that the launch would also include the presentation of evidence. a documentary-style compilation of verified messages, emails, and bank transfers that proved the campaign to defame Lina had been fabricated by those who stood to gain from her being discredited. The plan was deliberate. There would be no ambush. There would be transparency, chain of custody documents, forensic reports, witness affidavits. Samuel insisted on chronology. "If we present the truth as a story," he said, "it will be harder to ignore." Lina agreed. She wanted the truth to be kind, precise, and legally defensible. The morning of the launch, Lina rose early. She walked the riverbank while the city still rehearsed its day. Joggers, an early barista arranging cups, the light on the water like a promise. She hummed the lullaby she had been adding verses to, and she recited the lines she had written in the book. Truth, do no harm, build for the child. She dressed in a simple dress the board had suggested, navy, modest, with a coat that could take wind. She did not seek a gown. She did not need to be jewelry. Her hands, small and calloused, were visible. The ballroom filled with the sound you hear in rooms where people do business. Polite laughter, the clink of silver, the small rustle of programs. Chandeliers threw light like well-placed questions. Photographers cued. Cameras blinked a strobe that set the air to an almost cinematic hum. Journalists murmured into recorders. The Hargroves arrived a study in tailored grief. Julian with his efficient jaw, Veronica with the practiced smile of one who wears alliances like a coat. Lina sat to the side with the board. The child, little Matteo, whom Thomas had known as a neighbor's grandson and had quietly cared for, was held by a woman from the clinic. Matteo's hair caught the light when he looked up and squinted. He did not yet understand how his presence would be used to test the city's temper. Lina's hand found his knee. The room felt like a pendulum waiting to swing. Samuel took the stage first. He spoke with the careful cadence of someone who has spent a lifetime translating law into plain speech. "We are here," he said, "to begin an initiative that will protect people from exploitation. We are also here to present documented evidence regarding a smear campaign that followed my client after Mr. Hargrove's passing. We will show, not allege, how certain individuals attempted to manufacture facts to support a narrative contrary to the truth." He gave the first packet to the press, redacted copies of emails, a cover page explaining chain of custody. On the screen behind him, images unfolded not as a venomous collage, but in forensic order. Screenshots with timestamps, server logs pointing to the originating IP addresses, a payment trail that linked a small PR firm to a bakery of anonymous accounts that had produced the fake sonogram. An audio clip confirmed what an IT analyst testified to. Someone had edited an ultrasound from stock images and then inserted metadata meant to appear credible. Short sentences were used where they mattered. The room emptied of the sound of chatter. "This is fabrication," Samuel said. "This is coordinated. These are paid attempts to create evidence where none exists. We have preserved it with logs, expert testimony, and notarized affidavits. We can show you the chain of custody now." The lights dimmed. The projection moved through the timeline. First, a draft email between Veronica and Elisa that proposed a smear narrative to protect assets. Then a receipt revealing compensation for a creative piece that promised a believable sonogram image. Then the lab that had produced the sonogram, a shell that traded in manipulated images. Finally, an internal message from Julian attempting to influence a reporter with an offer of exclusive statements and access to estate documents in return for sympathetic coverage. Gasps popped through the room like matches struck. The high society table across the way tightened. A donor put his napkin down as if he had been scalded. Veronica's smile stalled. Julian's hand went white against his program. Cameras leaned forward. But the revelation was not a blood sport. Samuel placed a binder's worth of documents on a table and invited journalists to examine the chain. He called up the forensic analyst, an earnest woman with a no-nonsense haircut, who explained in plain terms how metadata proves origin. "You can alter images," she said, "but the path they take leaves a record. We have that record." She handed over the logs, notarized, and the lead reporter adjusted his glasses and read with the hunger of someone who has been handed a story that resists a quick headline. One by one, the people who had pushed the false narrative found themselves having to account for purchases and messages. Questions that had been whispered in clubs now had to be spoken in polite sentences into microphones. Some denied, others hemmed and hawed. Veronica tried to speak. Her prepared remarks turned brittle in her mouth. And then she realized there was no ready defense for the email receipts and the bank transfers posted by the analysts. Julian, faced with the spreadsheet that linked him to payments for research that produced no sources, found his practiced expression cracking. Lina did not walk to the microphone immediately. She had practiced a brief statement in the privacy of Samuel's office, not as a thing to pierce, but as a thing to seal. When she spoke, her voice did not crack, but it contained the small fracture of all the months she had lived through. "This city has people who work quietly," she said. "They sweep sidewalks and mop floors and teach children. I have spent my life among those people. I married a man who trusted me. He prepared for this because he knew what could happen when someone stands to lose something. I will not use these papers to ruin people. I will use them to protect others." She announced the creation of the Legal Aid Fund, named for the woman whose photograph Thomas had pinned in that registry. His late sister, a woman no one had given enough obituary space. The fund's charter was printed and distributed. It would provide counsel to people accused of falsehoods, to those who could not afford to defend themselves against manufactured claims, to caretakers and domestic workers who are frequently the target of cunning narratives. She named the board, including people from the neighborhoods to those with legal expertise. She asked for accountability, not destruction. The room's energy shifted. Some faces softened, seeing the purpose. Others retreated into damage control. Veronica's voice became a quiet thing at the edges of the room. She moved away from microphones and toward a cluster of friends. Julian's phone lit with messages he had not meant to read out loud. The press had their story, one of scandal, but also a story of the procedural triumph of forensic truth over rumor. After the meeting, jurists and civic leaders commented publicly. An inquiry would examine the actions of those behind the false documents. Civil claims could be brought. Law enforcement observed the materials and opened a preliminary review, standard procedure when fabricated documents and payments for deceit are demonstrated with the kind of evidence Samuel presented. News outlets that had been ready to snack on the rumor now printed the logs and quoted the analyst's testimony. The PR firm that had sold fabricated context saw clients pull engagements. Private clubs rescinded invitations quietly, their members unwilling to be associated with a story turning toward negligence. One of the foundations that had once intended to partner with Julian's committee issued a discreet statement distancing itself. Boards where Veronica sat asked for explanations. The tribunal of society does not act like a court, but it acts in swiftness where public trust is at stake. Reputations crumble in ways newspapers can accelerate. For the first time in months, the chatter that had surrounded Lina was not about what she had taken, but about what had been taken from her. The pivot was not a miracle. It was evidence and patience, and a set of people who had learned to do things by the book. Lina's reaction was neither triumphal nor vengeful. In an interview the next day, she said, "I am grateful for the proof. I am relieved. But my work doesn't begin because I was accused. It begins because people like those who swept our sidewalks deserve law and fairness. We will help them." She spoke then, briefly, about Matteo, about how Thomas had loved him as if he were kin, and how the trust included provision for the child's education and housing. The press covered that too, and this part of the story read like a small consolation. legal consequences moved at the slow gait of institutions. Civil suits were filed by Samuel on Lina's behalf. For defamation, for the recovery of funds misdirected to create false evidence, and to compel disclosure from the parties who had coordinated the smear. Those suits would take months. Prosecutors opened a file for a potential fraud investigation, an inquiry into the payments, and whether any criminal statutes had been contravened when documentation was manufactured. The city's cultural institutions began to examine their own vetting procedures. These were not the thunderclap of tabloid vengeance. They were the slow, heavy clank of accountability, which, if it follows its course, does what gossip never can. It alters institutional behavior. Lina turned her public victory into programmatic action. The Foundation's first grants were not splashy. They were practical. Funding for legal clinics, paying for an additional paralegal at the clinic to assist people dealing with false accusations, scholarships for the children of working women, and seed money for a shelter that promised transitional services for those who had been forced out of homes because of slander. The board drew up metrics. Lina insisted on an external auditor. She refused to accept the gift of charity's glamour. She wanted it to be efficient, accountable, and durable. At the first board meeting after the launch, Lina spoke about dignity. "People who are small are not invisible," she said. "They are just often overlooked. My work will be to make sure they have records, counsel, and care." Her tone was neither sermon nor plea. It was a resolution. She appointed Rosa to head community outreach, and she named Matteo's care plan within the trust, including a guardian who would be responsible for education and health. Power, she discovered, is also the capacity to give permission. She used the funds to pay restitution for the clinic's delayed renovations and to make sure the shelter had a winter plan. She insisted the Foundation partner with community lawyers and civil rights clinics that already existed. "We don't want to replace them," she told the board. "We want to strengthen them." The Foundation published a transparent ledger available to anyone who asked. Samuel applauded the thoroughness. He had expected nothing less. Not everyone accepted the new reality. Veronica and her allies retreated to private counsel. They issued statements that blamed miscommunication and overzealous reporting. The city did what it does with people of means who have lost favor. Their invitations dwindled. Some boards asked for resignations, others negotiated agreements to avoid litigation. Julian faced a moment that felt like a collapse of entitlement. Club committees that had once deferred to him anymore asked for references and explanations. He began to understand what happens when paper is set against greed. Lina watched without malice. She had, from the start, chosen dignity over the kind of retribution that flattens both parties. She watched the slow work of law and reputation correct a narrative that had once seemed immovable. She gave interviews that emphasized the work of the Foundation rather than the spectacle of the reveal. When well-meaning reporters asked whether she had felt vindicated, she replied simply, "Vindication isn't a thing I need. Proof is. Justice is about preventing harm to others." As the months turned into a year, the Foundation funded an attorney to represent domestic workers facing false claims, provided emergency grants for families evicted due to defamatory rumors, and started a program teaching basic digital literacy to people who were often manipulated online. Lina attended events where she listened more than she spoke. She sat on panels and told the story in a way that forgave no one and sought to restore many. She created, deliberately, a public image, not of a woman who had consumed a fortune, but of someone who had chosen to steward it. People in Lina's old neighborhood noticed changes that were practical and immediate. The clinic bought refrigerated medicine chests. The after-school program had new computers. The shelter had a short-term fund to prevent evictions. Those were the sorts of things that do not get fashion pieces, but change lives. Lina still swept a street from time to time. It was private, a ritual that reminded her of who she had been and rooted her in the everyday. When children approached with questions, she answered them plainly. "What I have now is my chance to help," she would say. "That is my work." Matteo grew under the steady hand of a childhood that no longer needed to be a story. He began school in a district with better resources thanks to scholarship funds the foundation provided. He learned to whistle and then to spell his own name. He liked trains and sourced his pasta with his fingers the way small boys do. In public photographs, Lina held him, and people who had once rushed to judge now seemed to regard the sight with a softened disapproval of their former selves. The Hargrove family, for its part, made its own adjustments. Old alliances frayed. Some members left the city's social calendars quietly. Others entered settlement talks regarding access to family charities and archives. There was money enough for lawyers and apologies that fit into press statements, but apologies given under legal advice have the neatness of a stitched hem. They hold, but they do not warm. What mattered to Lina was not whether Julian or Veronica lost dinner invitations. It was whether people like Rosa would now have an advocate when smeared, and whether a child like Matteo would have educational security. A small victory came quietly. The PR firm whose junior employee had created false context issued a public apology and agreed to fund a digital literacy course the foundation sponsored, an awkward but practical redirection of resources. The lead columnist, who had once smirked at Lina's coat, wrote a follow-up that acknowledged the errors in relying on an anonymous tip and praised the forensic work that had established the truth. Journalists began to treat stories of accusation with more skepticism, a small culture change that felt tiny and enormous at once. Despite the outward calm, Lina's internal life remained steady with the small friction of responsibility. She still kept the leather book, now filled with minutes, contacts, and lists of grants. At night, she hummed the lullaby for Matteo and added a new verse about patient maps and lawyers who kept their promises. She walked the river sometimes and watched the reflection of the city, which no longer seemed like a place settled into two halves. It was a patchwork, messy and alive. People asked whether she had changed. She had. She spoke with more authority in rooms she would once have left quickly. Her hands had the same calluses. Her smile was less astonished at life's small mercies. She used the fortune, not as spectacle, but as infrastructure. She funded an apprenticeship program for young women who wanted to learn trades they had been told weren't theirs. She established a microloan fund so that a woman selling empanadas could expand without turning to predatory lenders. Each decision was a refusal of the caricature the tabloids had offered her, neither passive beneficiary nor vengeful avenger, but steward and architect of protection. Thomas Hargrove's presence remained in small things. There was a bench at the foundation's community garden with a plaque bearing his sister's name. A photograph of her printed in the foundation's first annual report. Residents who had known the old man told stories that did not paint him as foolish, but as someone who understood the fragility of dignity. His blindness was referred to with respect in these retellings. He had navigated the dark with an attentive mind and had left instructions that reflected his care. In one recorded interview, someone close to him said, "He knew what people would do when confronted with a will. He prepared for the worst, because he did not want his good to be the catalyst for harm." Legal matters settled into procedural cadence. The civil suits against those who had plotted the smear resulted in negotiated settlements in several cases, apologies, financial restitution, and agreed donations to charities that supported victims of defamation. A few professionals who had facilitated the fabrication faced inquiries from their licensing boards. Where criminal matters were plausible, such as the payment schemes that masked the source of funds, prosecutors pursued inquiries, and in a few instances, charges were brought, though Lina did not make public spectacle of those proceedings. Justice, she believed, should not be confused with revenge. It needed to be just. At a year's mark from the funeral, the foundation opened its first permanent office in a converted building near the clinic. The ribbon cutting was small. The press were invited, but not spectacles. Matteo, now older by a year if not by sense, tugged at Lina's sleeve and asked if they could plant a tree. Lina laughed, hugged him, and planted a sapling whose roots would one day make shade for people they did not yet know. The foundation announced a 5-year plan with concrete goals: legal aid hours, scholarships, emergency housing beds, and a digital education outreach team. There were critics, as there always are when money and power mingle. Some accused Lina of vanity, others whispered that Thomas had been naive in trusting her. Lina did not answer every whisper. She answered instead with meetings and receipts, with the rhythm of checks written and programs launched. She invited community feedback and created a small advisory council to audit programs annually. Transparency, she had learned, is the antidote to suspicion. In the quieter hours, away from cameras and boardrooms, she still swept the corner she had always swept, when the air was thin with mourning. People would pause now, not to sneer, but sometimes to ask for advice on filling out a scholarship form or where to go for legal consultation. Lina would help, speaking plainly, filling out the blank spaces, handing over a stamped envelope like a small lifeline. Her life had not become a parade. It had become a longer reach. One spring morning, a woman who had once been a harsh critic, someone who had offered sharp questions at a town hall meeting, approached Lina with a folded piece of paper. She apologized for her earlier tone and volunteered to help with the foundation's mentorship program. Lina accepted. The woman's conversion was not complete solace for the past, but it was proof that people can change. The city's narrative had been altered not by a single dramatic unmasking, but by the slow accumulation of deeds and evidence. In private, when she opened Thomas's letter, Lina sometimes read the line, "Patience, my daughter," and felt the warmth of the man's confidence like a hand on her shoulder. She kept the small leather-bound book with his instructions in a drawer, and she added to it a ledger of grants given, names of those helped, the little wins that do not make headlines. She wrote notes to herself there too. Keep humility, keep accountability, keep the child first. Years later, when an investigative piece revisited the case, the tone had shifted markedly. The headline read, "Less like a dagger and more like a ledger entry. From accusation to advocacy. How evidence, patience, and law rewrote a story." The piece catalogued the moves Samuel had made, the forensic work, and the foundation's programs. Lina's name appeared not as a caricature, but as an example of stewardship. The final scenes of that chapter were quiet. Matteo, older now, reading a book under a sapling whose roots had grown firm. Rosa, overseeing a clinic that had new refrigeration and a modest staff of nurses. Lina at the foundation's desk, answering a call from a woman who needed help, filling out a form to defend herself from a false claim. She listened with the same attention she had once given to people asking for directions on the street. Then she wrote a check, brief and exact, for emergency housing for a family at risk. She had not used the papers Thomas left her to destroy people. She had used them to build protection. That choice, more than any tribunal or headline, defined her. People who had set out to make her small found that the tools of smallness, lies, manipulation, social exclusion, do not outwork the slow, technical and often prosaic work of law, governance, and community building. On a morning not unlike the first she had known, when the sky was pale and a tram sighed down its tracks, Lina swept in front of a bakery whose owner had come to rely on foundation grants to hire an apprentice. The woman inside called out that fresh rolls were available. Matteo waved from the doorway and then ran toward Lina, handing her a flaky pastry as a gift. They ate together, crumbs on their shirts. A child on a bicycle passed and shouted a hello. The city breathed. Lina thought of Thomas, of the silver key, and of the ledger she had kept. She thought of the many small acts that had become programs. She thought of patience, not as a passive thing but as a strategy, a discipline that requires planning and courage. She had been underestimated, and that had been an advantage. It allowed her to work unnoticed until she was ready. Her life was both ordinary and transformed. She did not attempt to erase the memory of humiliation. Instead, she used it as a blueprint for protection. She had chosen dignity over spectacle and built institutions that would outlast the tabloids. In the end, what had shocked the city was not that a poor street cleaner married a blind billionaire and inherited wealth, but that the wealth had been used to defend the dignity of the small and to create a legacy that began with the quiet work of one woman who knew how to wait. If you believe in patience and justice, share this story. If you want more stories where quiet strength turns the tide, subscribe and stay for the next tale.